Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where marriage isn't simply about flowers, rings, or questionable DJ playlists. It's about contracts, alliances, and sometimes survival. Imagine yourself stepping out of the chill night air into a heavy stone church, its walls echoing with centuries of whispered prayers and not a hint of central heating. The candles flicker against damp stone, casting halos of light that somehow make everyone look just a little more pious than they probably are. You adjust your cloak, shuffle forward, and realize you're here for a wedding, but not the kind you'd recognize. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing those little time zone check-ins. It feels like we are all sitting around the same medieval hearth together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hush in the church is broken only by the scrape of boots on stone and the whisper of heavy fabric. The bride enters, not necessarily glowing with joy, but certainly glowing with candlelight. Her veil isn't the fluffy netting you're used to. It's a long, heavy cloth that can be as simple as linen or, if her family is wealthy enough, something glittering with gold thread. It covers her hair and often her face, a physical reminder that in the eyes of the community, she's moving from one role to another. You half expect some medieval priest to mutter, "Achievement unlocked, wife." You're standing close enough to feel the tension. And make no mistake, this isn't just about two people saying "I love you." In fact, love isn't even a requirement. What matters here are the vows, sacred words spoken aloud, in public, because once they're said, there's no going back. In medieval Europe, marriage is considered one of the sacraments of the church, alongside baptism and last rites. That means breaking it isn't just socially messy, it's spiritually dangerous. Divorce? Practically unheard of. Annulments exist, sure, but they usually require influence, money, or a pope who really owes you a favor. The priest clears his throat, and you notice how much the language feels like a business deal. The couple must declare consent, both of them saying, essentially, "Yes, I take you." And historians still argue whether this was more symbolic than real consent, because pressure from families, local lords, or just plain survival often weighed heavier than any romantic spark. You glance at the bride, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Is she thrilled? Terrified? Just trying to remember the Latin phrases? It's impossible to tell under that veil. Here's where things get interesting: the location of the vows. You might imagine a happening inside, in front of an altar, but in many parts of Europe, especially in the earlier medieval centuries, marriages took place literally on the church steps. Picture that. You're standing outside, shivering, trying to shout your lifelong vows loud enough that the priest, the neighbors, and probably a couple of chickens can all hear. Why outside? Because marriage was considered a public contract, binding not just two people but two families, and it needed to be visible. Also, the church wanted clear evidence that the marriage was valid, so the more witnesses, the better. You rub your hands together against the cold. The priest intones the words, and then comes the ring. Not the sparkling diamond solitaire we think of now. That whole diamond tradition was basically a marketing campaign centuries later. Instead, it's often a simple metal band, slipped onto the bride's finger as a symbol of fidelity. Gold if you're rich, iron or bronze if you're not. Sometimes the groom gave a coin instead, handed over almost like a fee. Romantic, right? Nothing says eternal devotion quite like "here's some pocket change." But don't laugh too much, because even in its simplicity, this ring is powerful. Once it's placed, the vows are sealed. You can't just wake up the next morning and say, "Oops, changed my mind." The church believed that the moment of spoken consent created a binding union before God. Even if you hadn't consummated the marriage yet, those vows were enough. That's why whispered, secret promises, two teenagers saying "I marry you" behind a barn, could technically count. And yes, this led to all sorts of messy court cases where parents dragged their children in front of bishops, trying to prove whether a muttered phrase counted as a real marriage. Now, as you're standing there in the flickering candlelight, you realize that the veil covering the bride isn't just a fashion choice. It has layers of meaning. It represents modesty and chastity, yes, but it also protects her from the evil eye. Because, let's face it, in a world where people still believed witches might hex your cattle, nobody wanted to risk a cursed honeymoon. Sometimes the veil was lifted only after the vows, symbolizing her shift from daughter to wife. And in some places, the groom would literally hand the veil to his bride, as if to say, "Here, your identity just got updated in the system." The vows themselves could sound familiar, with phrases about taking each other for better, for worse. But the real kicker is obedience. The bride promises to obey, honor, and serve her husband, while his role is to protect and provide. You wince slightly, because even though it's wrapped in sacred language, it's also a stark reminder of the hierarchy baked into medieval marriage. Women were often legally absorbed into their husband's identity, losing certain rights and depending on him for representation in court. And yet, in practice, many medieval wives ran households, managed businesses, and even defended castles while their husbands were away. Historians still argue whether this made marriage more oppressive or more collaborative, depending on the region and the family. You glance around the church. The guests are watching intently, some yawning because, let's be honest, medieval ceremonies could drag. Kids fidget. An old man sneezes into his sleeve, which might now doom the marriage if you believe certain superstitions. And you, still half frozen from standing near the door, think about how surreal it is that this little ritual, these whispered Latin words, this plain band of metal, has the power to reshape lives completely. As the couple clasps hands, you notice the priest doesn't just bless them, he blesses the bed they'll share. Yes, right there in the church. The logic is clear. Marriage is about producing heirs, binding families, and yes, continuing the Christian community. You shift uncomfortably, wondering if the priest really needed to mention the bed part in front of Grandma. But hey, that's medieval bluntness for you. There's a subtle humor in all this. You've survived modern weddings with endless speeches, bad catering, and that one uncle who insists on doing the worm on the dance floor. But here, you'd be lucky to survive the cold, the solemnity, and the realization that there's no quick exit. Once the vows are spoken, you're in it for life, or until plague, famine, or war decides otherwise. The ceremony closes with a kiss, not the passionate kind, but a formal sealing of the vows. Some accounts suggest the kiss was less about romance and more about symbolizing peace between families, almost like two knights shaking hands. And just like that, the church bells toll, the crowd stirs, and you step back into the medieval night. The bride still veiled, the groom looking slightly bewildered, and you wondering what exactly you just witnessed. As you trudge away, your breath misting in the cold air, you realize you've just seen the heart of medieval marriage, a sacred contract, wrapped in ritual, laced with superstition, and not always about love. You probably won't survive the feast that comes next, but that's a story for later. You shuffle out of the chill churchyard, your ears still ringing faintly with the echo of vows and bells, when the crowd begins to drift toward another gathering place. No one seems in a rush, but you can feel the weight of expectation in the air. Because as sacred as the vows may have been, the real business of marriage, emphasis on business, happens outside the candlelight. You follow along, and soon enough you're overhearing conversations that sound less like romance and more like a marketplace. See, in the medieval world, a wedding is rarely just two people promising fidelity. It's two families negotiating assets. And when we say assets, we mean the bride herself is part of the calculation. Don't get me wrong, she's not a literal object, but she is the vehicle for property, alliances, and money to change hands. Think of it as the medieval version of a corporate merger, except the legal paperwork is written in Latin, and the main executive officer is a priest with a serious poker face. You edge closer to one knot of relatives, pretending to admire a particularly muddy cloak while listening in. They're discussing the dowry. Now, a dowry is essentially the wealth that a bride's family gives to the groom's family upon marriage. It could be money, land, livestock, or even household goods. In one account from northern Italy, entire vineyards were passed along as part of a marriage contract. Imagine being 16 years old and realizing your hand in marriage just secured someone a lifetime of free wine. The practice of dowries wasn't just about generosity, it was security. The bride's dowry often became her safety net. If her husband died, that wealth was meant to support her in widowhood. Of course, whether she ever got to control or even touch that wealth is another story. Historians still argue whether dowries genuinely empowered women by giving them assets, or simply shifted wealth between male heads of households. You stand there, trying to imagine the bride herself raising her hand to argue, "Actually, that cow is mine." Spoiler, probably not going to happen. But here's where things get quirky. Sometimes the bride price, the payment or gift from the groom's side, joined the dowry in what could feel like a bizarre exchange of treasures. In Anglo-Saxon England, for example, the groom might give a mourning gift to his bride after the wedding night. This wasn't a bouquet or a piece of jewelry. It could be land or livestock. Imagine waking up, yawning, and being told, "Surprise! You now own 3 sheep and a pigsty." Not quite a spa day, but useful. You try to picture the conversation. The bride's father haggling like he's selling a prized horse. The groom's uncle insisting that 3 silver cups and a plot of marshland are far too much for a girl who can't even embroider straight. It's absurd, and yet deadly serious. Because behind all the squabbling lies power. Dowries and bride prices could determine whether a family rose in status or fell into ruin. Sometimes the negotiations got creative. In poorer families, dowries might include a bed, some linens, or a chest of cookware. Picture it. Congratulations on your wedding. Here's a ladle and a blanket. May your union be blessed. In noble circles, though, we are talking castles, towns, even entire armies of retainers being promised. The stakes were sky high. And that veil-covered bride. She's the hinge on which these fortunes swing. You trail along with the group as they finally settle into a hall, the air thick with smoke from the hearth and the tang of ale. The chatter grows louder, and someone slaps down a parchment contract on the table. Medieval contracts aren't just rumors, they're ironclad. Written in Latin, witnessed by priests or notaries, and sealed with wax, these documents detail exactly who owes what. And yes, they'll spell out things like, should the bride die without children, half the land reverts to her family. Romantic, right? You almost expect the contract to have a footnote. Terms and conditions apply. See your local bishop for details. Now, here's a detail that would make even your modern lawyer squirm. Sometimes the contracts also listed penalties if either party backed out. Imagine a runaway groom having to cough up a penalty of 200 silver coins because he got cold feet. And yes, there are recorded cases of marriages falling apart because one side couldn't deliver the promised sheep. Truly, love's young dream dies hardest when the livestock won't show up. You catch the bride's expression across the room. Hard to read under that veil, but you'd guess she's not thrilled about being itemized like a chest of drawers. And yet, for her, this negotiation determines everything. Where she'll live, how secure she'll be, even how much independence she might have. In some regions, particularly in parts of Italy, brides actually did have more say over their dowries. Wealthy Florentine women, for example, sometimes used their dowries to establish influence and act as patrons of art. So the next time you admire a Renaissance painting, you might be indirectly thanking some medieval bride whose wedding dowry funded it. But here's a fringe tidbit that doesn't make the textbooks often. Not all buying the bride rituals were symbolic. In certain villages, especially in Eastern Europe, traditions lingered where a groom literally bought access to his bride during the wedding feast. The guests would block him from entering the bridal chamber until he paid a symbolic ransom, coins, drinks, or gifts. You can almost hear the drunken laughter as he finally forks over a jug of mead just to be let through the door. Was it fun? Was it humiliating? Historians still argue whether this ritual was playful theatre or a darker reminder of women's commodification. Meanwhile, you notice that the entire town seems invested in the outcome of these deals. Why? Because marriages bind not only two families but entire communities. A noble dowry might stabilize borders between rival lords. A peasant's dowry might merge two farms into a stronger unit, protecting everyone in times of famine. To you, standing here as a bystander, it feels almost like a village-wide business meeting disguised as a celebration. And then, of course, there's the question of what if there's no dowry? In poorer families, this could mean the bride had fewer prospects. Sometimes, dowry-less women entered convents instead of marrying, which makes you realize, in a way, the convent was the backup plan for women whose families couldn't strike a deal. Not exactly a follow-your-bliss situation, but practical in a society that feared single women wandering unanchored. Now, let's step sideways into one of those scholarly debates. Some historians argue that dowries actually gave women leverage. If her dowry was substantial, a wife could pressure her husband's family to treat her well, knowing her kin might reclaim the property if she was mistreated. Others, though, insist that it was just another way to funnel wealth through men. Standing in this smoky hall, surrounded by grumbling uncles and scribbling notaries, you can see both sides of the argument. It's leverage, but only if the people in power respect it. You glance down at the table. Someone scrawled a little doodle of a rooster in the corner of the contract. Maybe even medieval scribes got bored during endless negotiations. And you laugh quietly to yourself because you know that somewhere in the future, wedding guests will be equally restless, scrolling on phones during speeches, doodling in programs, waiting impatiently for the free cake. Some things never change. By the time the negotiations wind down, the bride is technically secured, the groom's family looks smug, and the ink on the parchment glistens under candlelight. It's official. This marriage isn't just about whispered vows. It's about wealth, survival, and who gets the better end of the deal. You feel a little sorry for the couple themselves, who haven't had much say. But then again, survival in this world rarely gives you the luxury of choice. As the hall erupts in laughter and the ale begins to flow, you lean back and wonder what comes next. You've seen the vows, you've watched the bargaining, and yet something tells you this is only the beginning of the strangeness. Because tomorrow, you'll see ropes binding wrists, rituals involving bread and salt, and perhaps even a bridal bed that's disturbingly public. You probably won't survive the embarrassment, but you're definitely along for the ride. The hall grows quieter as the last of the dowry parchment dries, and someone with a booming voice announces the next stage. You trail along with the crowd, tugged almost like a leaf in a river, until you find yourself back in a more solemn setting. This time, you notice something strange being carried forward, a coil of rough rope, the kind that might otherwise be used to tether an ox or lash a cartload of firewood. And yet, tonight, it's destined for something entirely different. It's going to bind two lives together. You've probably heard the phrase tying the knot. Here, you're about to see it in its literal, itchy, slightly uncomfortable form. The priest raises the rope, his fingers smudged with wax from the candles. The couple step forward again, their hands extended, and with deliberate care, the rope is looped around their wrists. One twist, then another, sometimes even a knot, until the two are bound together like cargo ready for transport. You lean closer, curious, and the smell of hemp tickles your nose. This, you realize, is hand fasting, a ritual older than the stone church itself. Some say it stretches back to Celtic traditions, where couples bound their hands together to symbolize their union. Others argue that it was simply a practical way to show consent when literacy was rare. No signatures, no quills, just rope and witnesses. Historians still argue whether the church invented it, tolerated it, or merely co-opted something villagers were already doing. But either way, here it is in front of you, a medieval wedding as physical contract. The symbolism is almost too on the nose. Bound hands mean bound lives. You can't run away without dragging the other person with you. Romantic if you squint, terrifying if you think too hard. You catch the groom flexing his fingers slightly, maybe testing whether he could slip free if necessary. Spoiler, not a chance. That knot is holding fast. What's fascinating is how varied the practice was. In some regions, the hands were tied only loosely, the rope draped over wrists like a scarf. In others, it was tied tight, knotted so firmly that circulation became a memory. Some couples had their right hands bound, others both sets. In Scotland, certain traditions allowed couples to handfast for a year and a day, a trial marriage of sorts. If they still liked each other at the end, they renewed the bond. If not, well, no harm done. Was this a widespread custom? Historians still argue whether it was formal law or just folklore later romanticized. Either way, you can picture villagers chuckling as a couple untied themselves after 366 days, muttering, "Well, that was fun, goodbye." You shift your weight from one foot to the other, feeling the solemnity in the room. The priest murmurs blessings over the bound hands, invoking saints, angels, and sometimes local spirits who never quite disappeared from rural imagination. The flickering candles make the rope look like a serpent coiling around the couple, and you can't help but think of biblical warnings about yokes and burdens. A medieval audience would have caught that imagery instantly. Marriage isn't a frolic, it's a heavy responsibility, tied together for better or worse. And yet, the quirky side of things can't be ignored. In certain villages, people believe that how the knot was tied foretold the marriage's fate. A neat, symmetrical knot? Orderly life ahead. A messy, tangled knot? Expect constant bickering. You almost want to sneak closer and tug the rope into chaos, just to see if anyone notices. Imagine the gossip. Well, of course they fought about chickens for 30 years. Did you see that knot? Then there's the color of the binding. Hemp rope was common, but in wealthier circles, ribbons or even strips of silk might be used. Red was thought to symbolize passion, gold prosperity, green fertility. Picture a noble couple's wrists wrapped in shimmering silk, the fabric later tucked away as a keepsake. Somewhere in a chest, centuries later, archaeologists might stumble across a faded ribbon and wonder about the hands it once held. As you stand among the murmuring guests, your mind drifts to the question of choice. The vows earlier felt binding enough, but this rope really drives the point home. Could the bride have refused? Possibly, but socially disastrous. Could the groom? Even less likely. His family's reputation, and sometimes their land, now depended on this union. You realize that in medieval thought, the knot wasn't just metaphorical, it was destiny made visible. And then comes the moment when the rope is removed. Sometimes immediately after the blessing, sometimes only at the end of the ceremony. You watch as the priest untwists it slowly, as though drawing out the suspense. There's a collective breath, almost relief, when the wrists are free again. But the symbolism lingers. Even without rope, the bond remains. You flex your own hands unconsciously, grateful that no one is tying you to anyone tonight. Here's a fringe tidbit. In a few records, the rope wasn't kept but burned after the ceremony, the smoke rising like a prayer. Other times, it was preserved as a charm against marital discord. Imagine pulling out a ratty rope during an argument centuries later. Don't you dare shout at me. This rope says we are blessed. Practical, Maybe not. Powerful. Definitely. You can't help but notice how tactile the whole thing is. Modern weddings often deal in abstract gestures, rings, kisses, signatures. But here, you literally feel the scratch of rope, the pressure of another hand against your own. It's earthy, physical, undeniably real. You're not just hearing about commitment, you're wearing it. And that sensation, rough fibers cutting into skin, must have made the vows sink deeper than words ever could. Some guests start humming a tune, low and steady, as the binding takes place. It's not exactly a love song, more like a chant to steady nerves and remind everyone that this is serious. One old woman mutters under her breath, probably a folk charm meant to keep demons away. Because of course, even in sacred moments, people worried about dark forces sneaking in. A badly tied knot wasn't just sloppy, it might open the door for misfortune. You watch the couple glance at each other through the ritual. Their hands are bound, their fates aligned, but their eyes still tell separate stories. The groom looks proud, maybe nervous. The bride looks resigned, or perhaps quietly determined. You wonder if, under all the ritual and rope, two actual people are trying to make sense of what just happened to them. The rope comes off, the blessing is done, and the crowd stirs again. Someone cracks a joke about how now they can't escape each other even if they try, and laughter ripples through the room. Because yes, even in the medieval world, humor found its way into the most solemn occasions. You smile, imagining couples in every century whispering the same jokes. Well, you're stuck with me now. As the guests shuffle toward the next stage of the celebration, you linger a moment longer, watching the rope being coiled back up. Simple hemp, nothing fancy, and yet it carried so much meaning. You think about all the knots tied before and after, each one a small act of faith, fear, or necessity. And as you step out into the cool night air again, you can't help but feel the ghost of rough fibers against your own wrist, as if you've been bound to this strange medieval journey whether you like it or not. And you probably won't survive what comes next, the witness bed. But hey, you've made it this far. You think the rope ritual was awkward? Just wait. The crowd begins to move again, this time with a strange sense of anticipation, half solemn, half mischievous. You tag along, swept into a wave of villagers and nobles alike, until you reach a chamber warmed by a smoky hearth. The air smells of straw, sweat, and the faint sweetness of herbs tossed onto the fire. In the center of the room stands a large bed, its wooden posts thick as tree trunks, draped in heavy curtains. And suddenly, you realize what's about to happen. The bride and groom are going to bed, and they're not doing it alone. Welcome to one of the most bizarre customs of medieval marriage, the witness bed. In some parts of Europe, especially among nobles and wealthy households, the consummation of a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until at least part of the community, or at least some appointed witnesses, confirmed it happened. Yes, you heard right. Imagine your wedding night with an audience. You probably won't survive the embarrassment. You glance around the room, hoping someone's going to say this is just symbolic. But no, several guests are bustling about, pulling back the covers, scattering flower petals, and joking in the kind of way people do when they're nervous but pretending not to be. Someone brings in a jug of wine, another lights more candles, and you realize this is more than a private ritual. It's a performance, meant to prove the union is not just spiritual or contractual, but physical. Why such a custom? Think of what's at stake. In a world where inheritance, land, and dynasties depended on legitimate heirs, it wasn't enough to hear vows. You needed evidence the marriage was consummated. No heirs, no future. So communities developed rituals to confirm that the couple actually did the deed, or at least climbed into bed with every intention of doing so. Some regions settled for witnesses escorting the couple to bed, seeing them tucked in, and then politely leaving. Others lingered. You shudder. Here's a mainstream fact. In France, noble weddings often involved a bedding ceremony. The couple would be undressed, sometimes by attendants of the same sex, while guests crowded around, singing bawdy songs. The groom might be handed symbolic gifts like a belt or sword, the bride a distaff or spindle, representing their gendered roles. Finally, the priest would bless the bed itself. That's right, not just the couple, but the furniture got holy approval. You glance at the mattress and wonder if it feels honored or just weary from years of creaking under newlyweds. Quirky tidbit time. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, the community sometimes banged pots and pans outside the chamber, a noisy tradition called charivari or polterabend. It was meant to scare away evil spirits, but also, let's be honest, to embarrass the couple into proving their union. Imagine trying to get romantic while the whole village is outside, clanging cookware like an out-of-tune marching band. Subtle? Not exactly. Memorable? Definitely. As you stand there, you catch snippets of debate among the older guests. Some argue that these bedding rituals were purely symbolic, the witnesses leaving before anything scandalous happened. Others claim they really did stay and watch until they had evidence. Historians still argue about just how far this went. Was it voyeurism wrapped in piety? Or just theatre, with the actual intimacy left behind closed curtains? No one can say for sure, but you're beginning to hope it's the latter. The groom looks flushed, whether from wine or nerves. The bride, still partially veiled, is led to the bed by her ladies. They unlace a gown, fussing with ribbons and sleeves, while guests whistle and make jokes that sound suspiciously similar to modern best man speeches. Awkward, teasing, but meant to lighten the tension. One old man mutters a rhyme about fertility that you really wish you didn't understand. You try to keep a straight face, but the whole scene feels like a medieval mashup of sacred ritual and slapstick comedy. When the bride is finally tucked beneath the covers, the groom climbs in after her to a chorus of laughter and cheers. Someone sprinkles holy water over the bed. Someone else throws grain, symbolizing fertility. You realize the community isn't just ensuring heirs, they're investing themselves in this union. By witnessing the bedding, they're taking responsibility for its legitimacy. If anyone ever questioned the marriage later, the witnesses could say, "Yes, we saw them go to bed." Talk about peer pressure. And it wasn't only nobles. Among peasants, too, the bedding could become a public event. After the feast, villagers might escort the couple to their home, singing and laughing, and sometimes refusing to leave until they had some proof of consummation. Proof could be anything from rumpled sheets to, disturbingly, stained linens displayed the next day. That last detail makes you grimace, but in communities obsessed with legitimacy, visible signs mattered. The linen became legal evidence, as binding as any parchment contract. The line between ritual and reality blurs here. Were couples actually expected to perform before others? In most cases, probably not. The bedding was likely more about symbolism, with guests leaving before things got too private. Still, even the symbolic presence of a crowd on your wedding night would be enough to sap any romance. You shift uncomfortably, thinking how your modern sensibilities would never survive this tradition. And yet, for medieval folk, it made sense. Life was communal. Privacy was rare. Families often shared beds in crowded cottages. Travelers bunked together in inns, and children were born with half the village standing outside the door. The idea of intimacy as purely private is modern. In their world, marriage was a public institution, and its consummation part of the public record. The priest now mutters a final blessing, and the curtains are drawn around the bed. The crowd begins to disperse, though not before a few guests toss cheeky comments about hoping for a boy child. You slip out into the corridor, relieved that the ritual is over but still unsettled. What must it have felt like to be the bride, undressed and tucked in under so many watchful eyes? Did she feel humiliation? Pride? A strange kind of reassurance that the whole community was rooting for her? You'll never know, but you can't shake the thought. Here's a quirky little aside. In some traditions, children or unmarried girls were tasked with sleeping in the same room as the couple on their wedding night. Not in the bed, thankfully, but nearby, to serve as witnesses and keep away evil spirits. Imagine being the unlucky 12-year-old cousin who had to sit by the fire all night listening to muffled noises. You probably won't survive the trauma, or the teasing from friends later. What fascinates you most is how this ritual blends sacred and profane. On one hand, you've got priests blessing the bed, invoking divine favor. On the other, you've got drunken villagers banging pots and making dirty jokes. It's a perfect snapshot of medieval life. Faith and farce intertwined so tightly that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You pause in the corridor, leaning against the cool stone wall, as muffled laughter and the rustle of curtains drift through the door behind you. This, you realize, is more than just a quirky custom. It's about control. Communities needed to control marriage, to make sure it was legitimate, fruitful, and binding. And what better way than to put eyes on the most intimate moment? It's invasive, yes, but also practical in a world where the wrong air could spark wars. The noise in the room dies down, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the crackle of the hearth. You step away, the sound fading as you make your way down the hall. Outside, the night is alive with laughter and clanging pans, friends and neighbors still carrying on the noisy celebration. You can almost imagine the bride and groom rolling their eyes behind the curtains, muttering, "Can't they just go home already?" Some wedding nights are universal, after all. As you wander back into the cold air, you realize how strange and yet strangely logical this custom is. To medieval minds, love was secondary, privacy was rare, and community was everything. And if you want to prove a marriage, nothing proves it like a bed blessed by priests, surrounded by family, and serenaded by drunk villagers with pots and pans. You probably won't survive the embarrassment, but hey, at least you'd never have to worry about nosy in-laws. They already saw everything. The laughter and pot-banging fade behind you as you step into a new space, one filled with the tantalizing smell of roasted meat and sweet honey. Your stomach growls before your mind catches up. The bedding may be done, but the celebration is only shifting gears. You're about to witness the heart of medieval wedding sustenance and symbolism, the ritual foods that carried meaning far beyond simple nourishment. The hall is alive with light. Candles drip fat wax-down wrought iron sconces, their flames bouncing against tapestries woven with hunting scenes and saints' faces. Long wooden tables stretch the length of the room, groaning under platters of bread, dishes of salt, and great clay pitchers of mead. These are not just refreshments, they are talismans, edible blessings, physical prayers for prosperity, fertility, and luck. The first item you notice is the bread. Loaves of every shape lie piled high, some round and golden like miniature suns, others long and rustic, dusted with flour. A boy with red cheeks carries one to the high table and sets it before the bride and groom. The loaf is large, scored with patterns you realize are not random. They form a cross, an ancient sign of blessing. Bread, the staff of life, was not just food. It was survival, prosperity, and divine provision baked into one. To offer bread was to say, "May you never hunger, may your household always be filled, may your union yield abundance." But bread was not merely placed. It was broken. The groom takes the loaf in both hands, splitting it with a firm crack that makes crumbs scatter onto the table. He gives the first piece to his bride, an act that feels intimate despite the hundreds of eyes watching. She accepts, and then passes a bite back to him. Mutual giving, mutual sustaining. A cycle that would echo in every meal of their married life. You catch yourself smiling. It's strangely tender, tucked between the rowdy noise and ceremony. Next comes the salt. A small, ornate salt cellar is carried forward, glinting in the candlelight. To us, Salt might be an afterthought, but in medieval Europe it was precious, sometimes called white gold. Entire economies turned on its trade. To eat salt together was to swear loyalty, to seal friendship, to ward off corruption both physical and spiritual. Salt purified, preserved, and symbolized incorruptibility. The priest sprinkles a pinch over the bread, then offers the couple each a grain on the tip of a knife. It seems absurdly small compared to the mound of loaves, but the message is clear. May your marriage be preserved against rot, your love protected from bitterness. You think about the irony. Salt makes food taste sharper, yet hear it represent harmony. Perhaps it's a reminder that even the sting of hardship can season life if endured together. And then, the mead. The great pitchers are uncorked, releasing a heady fragrance of fermented honey, herbs, and fruit. Cups are filled and passed down the rows, foamy liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rims. When you lift one to your lips, the sweetness nearly overwhelms you. Thick, golden, sticky on the tongue. Mead was more than alcohol. It was considered a gift of the gods, a bridge between the human and divine. In some Norse traditions, it was linked directly to fertility, its honeyed richness thought to encourage fruitfulness in the womb. You sip, and suddenly the word honeymoon makes perfect sense. Newlyweds were expected to drink mead daily for a month after the wedding, one full cycle of the moon, so that fertility might be assured. Mead was less a toast than a prescription, and every gulp tonight is part blessing, part obligation. You glance at the bride and groom raising their shared cup. The crowd cheers, shouting blessings, bawdy jokes, and the occasional reminder to drink deep, for sons and daughters must follow. The pressure is heavy, but in their smiles you see a flicker of relief. They are not alone. The whole hall drinks with them. Your seatmate, a wrinkled woman with a scarf tied tightly under her chin, nudges you. Bread for plenty, salt for protection, mead for children, she mutters, as if reciting a formula. You realize these rituals were less about romance and more about communal security. A fertile marriage meant heirs. Heirs meant stable landholding. Stable landholding meant fewer disputes. Each symbolic bite and sip was insurance for the whole village, not just the couple. And yet, beyond practicality, there's beauty here. Every culture, every age, finds ways to wrap its hopes into rituals. Today it's bread, salt, and mead. Tomorrow it might be cake and champagne. But the wish is the same. May joy multiply, may sorrow be shared, may the couple grow roots and branches like a tree watered with sweetness. As the feast continues, you see variations unfold. On one table, bread is dipped in honey and passed hand to hand, each person blessing the couple as they take a bite. On another, salt is thrown into the fire to drive away ill fortune. A minstrel strums a lute and sings a ballad of two lovers who nearly lost each other, only to be reunited by a miracle of mead flowing from a stone. You can't tell if it's history or legend, but no one seems to care. The mead has loosened tongues and hearts alike. Here's a quirky tidbit you overhear. In some Slavic lands, newlyweds received bread and salt at the threshold of their new home, carried in by the bride's mother-in-law. The bride had to break the bread with her teeth, and if she managed a large bite, it meant she would rule the household. If not, well, the husband's dominance was secured. You can't help but laugh. Apparently even bread tests became battlegrounds for authority. Another tale drifts your way. In parts of England, wedding guests would present the couple with a spice cake baked with symbolic ingredients: flour for plenty, sugar for sweetness, spices for passion. Salt, always, to bind it all together. Over time, these cakes grew taller and fancier until they evolved into the tiered wedding cakes we know today. You marvel at how modern traditions hide ancient echoes. When you bite into cake at a wedding now, you're nibbling on centuries of layered meanings. The drinking grows louder, and with it the toasts. Nobles raise jeweled goblets. Peasants lift rough wooden mugs. The words are different, but the message is the same: prosperity, fertility, harmony. Some toast with earnest prayers, others with ribald jokes that make you choke on your drink. The mead flows until your head feels light and the hall spins in golden warmth. But beneath the cheer, you sense the seriousness. These people knew hunger, famine, child mortality. Bread was not guaranteed. Salt was expensive. Mead required bees, hives, harvests of honey, all vulnerable to blight, theft, or war. To share them at a wedding was no small thing. It was a declaration. We give the best of what we have to these two, because their union is our survival. You watch as children sneak scraps of bread, as old men lick the last grains of salt from their fingers, as women refill pitchers with careful hands. The hall hums with a rhythm older than the bricks, older than the faith that sanctifies it. Eat, share, bless, drink, over and over, weaving a spell of continuity. The bride and groom now clasp hands around a shared cup of mead, holding it carefully as if it contains not liquid but fate itself. They sip together, their lips brushing the same rim, their eyes locking briefly. It's the first truly private moment you've seen between them all day, though even that is observed by everyone. You wonder what they're thinking. Do they taste hope, fear, obligation, or just the sweet, dizzying rush of honey wine? As the mead burns warmly in your chest, you realize the brilliance of these rituals. They transform ordinary things, bread, salt, drink, into extraordinary promises. They tie the couple not just to each other, but to the land, the community, the divine. To eat salt is to share permanence. To drink mead is to share destiny. To break bread is to share life. Hours pass in a haze of chewing, drinking, laughter, and song. By the time the platters are scraped clean, you feel both stuffed and strangely light. This was no mere meal. It was an incantation, a collective wish spoken through food. And as you stumble outside into the cool night air, you know the taste of medieval marriage is not just in words or contracts. It lingers on the tongue. Warm bread, sharp salt, and golden mead. You wipe crumbs from your cloak and breathe deep, steadying yourself against the dizzy sweetness. Tomorrow may bring quarrels, duties, or disappointments, but tonight, at least, the couple has been filled, blessed, and fortified by the three staples of survival. Their marriage, like the bread, will be broken and shared. Their life, like salt, will preserve and protect. And their love, like mead, will burn golden in the cup, at least for a while. You barely have time to wipe the honey from your lips before the atmosphere shifts again. The clamor of the feast dies down to a low hum, and whispers move through the hall like a breeze carrying strange pollen. Guests begin producing small objects from pouches and sleeves, some wrapped in linen, others dangling from cords. A cluster of women pass around what looks like a fragment of bone, kissing it reverently before slipping it into the bride's palm. Welcome to the secret, half-hidden layer of the medieval wedding. The charms, the talismans, the relics borrowed to shield a marriage from forces both earthly and otherworldly. It seems that bread and mead weren't enough insurance. You glance at the groom's mother as she produces a tiny amulet, a carved bit of jet-polished smooth by years of handling. She presses it against her son's chest before tucking it under his tunic, whispering words you can't quite catch. Around you, the air feels thicker, as though invisible threads are being spun between every object and every blessing. The most striking of these offerings are bones. Not grisly skulls or femurs, but tiny, sacred fragments of saints kept in reliquaries. To touch a saint's relic was to brush against divine power itself. And so, lending a sliver of bone to a couple on their wedding day was thought to anchor their union under holy protection. You shiver, imagining the bride hiding a relic in her bodice as if wearing armor against misfortune. Historians still argue whether these relics were commonly accessible to ordinary folk or mostly reserved for the wealthy, but the symbolism is undeniable. May death never conquer the living bond just sealed. Others rely on humbler charms. A bride might slip a sprig of rue or rosemary into her garter to guard against the evil eye. A groom might tuck an iron nail into his shoe for strength. Some guests pinched a bit of ash from the hearth and smeared it onto the couple's foreheads, a gritty reminder of mortality but also of resilience. You watch one uncle do just that, leaving faint black smudges like war paint. He grins toothlessly, clearly convinced he has done them a service. And then there are the borrowed items. Long before something borrowed, something blue became a rhyme. Medieval brides carried objects lent by happily married women, the logic being that good fortune could rub off like scent on fabric. A borrowed girdle, a ribbon, even a knife. It didn't matter, so long as it carried the essence of a successful union. You notice the bride clutching a ring too large for her finger, strung on a cord around her neck. Its original owner beams proudly from the sidelines, as if to say, "My luck is yours now." Quirkier still, in some rural communities, people believe that to keep witches away, the bride had to wear shoes with odd bits hidden inside, sometimes a scrap of old leather, sometimes even a dried frog. You glance downward nervously, half expecting amphibian toes to peek out from a slipper. If the villagers around you believe it works, who are you to argue? After all, in an age when disease and envy were blamed on malevolent forces, you'd probably stuff a toad in your shoe too. What fascinates you is how seamlessly sacred and superstitious mingle. One moment the priest blesses a relic of Saint Agnes, the next, a grandmother insists on hanging a wolf's tooth over the bed. It's as if people hedge their bets. Why not gather every power, divine and folk, to guard a fragile marriage? You sense the underlying anxiety. Marriages weren't just about two people. They were about inheritance, alliances, the survival of entire families. To leave them exposed to fate alone would be reckless. A hush falls as the couple are guided to the center of the hall. The bride's borrowed amulet and the groom's hidden iron nail are raised up by the priest, who pretends not to notice the more questionable charms. He speaks of holy unions, of Christ the bridegroom and the church the bride, weaving the sanctity of Scripture over objects that may once have sat on a cottage shelf beside onions and goose fat. You can't help but chuckle. The divine and domestic are always closer than they appear. But not everyone agreed on the value of charms. Historians still argue whether church authorities tolerated them as harmless tradition or condemned them as pagan remnants. Some sermons thundered against reliance on trifles of bone and stone, while others quietly allowed villagers their tokens so long as the sacraments were obeyed. You imagine local priests sighing, looking the other way as women tucked herbs into sleeves. After all, if the marriage lasted, who could deny that every little blessing helped? The quirky details keep piling up. You hear a guest mutter about tying knots and strings and hiding them under the marriage bed to ensure fertility. Another swears that carrying a cat's whisker in your pocket will keep jealousy at bay. And somewhere across the room, a boy sneezes loudly, immediately prompting his aunt to cross herself 3 times and throw a pinch of salt behind her shoulder. Apparently, even sneezes might draw bad spirits to the newlyweds. As the evening deepens, the couple are laden with so many objects they look like walking reliquaries. Bones tucked into sashes, herbs braided into hair, charms dangling from cords. They must feel the weight of centuries pressing against their skin, as if every ancestor and saint were crowding around to say, "We've got you covered. Don't mess this up." Yet beneath the layers of superstition, you glimpse something tender. Each object represents care. A grandmother's bone fragment, a friend's borrowed ribbon, a mother's sprig of rue. All these are expressions of love disguised as magic. They are ways for the community to give pieces of themselves, hoping those pieces shield the couple when life inevitably turns cruel. When the ritual ends, the relics are collected again, the borrowed returned, the charms tucked away. But the memory lingers, and you feel the faint pressure of unseen eyes, whether saints, spirits, or simply gossiping neighbors, watching to see if the marriage holds. You step back into the night, your mind buzzing not with mead this time, but with questions. Did these charms truly work? Or was their power simply the comfort they gave, the belief that no couple was left undefended? Historians still argue, and you suspect they always will. But as you picture the bride brushing her borrowed ring before sleep, you know the answer mattered less than the reassurance. In a world of uncertainty, hope itself was the strongest charm of all. If the feast was the body of the celebration, and the charms were its armor, then the dancing was its heartbeat. You barely notice when the servants clear the trestle tables from the center of the hall, but suddenly the space yawns wide, and a ripple of excitement passes through the guests. Lutes are tuned, shawms tested, and the steady thump of a drum sets a pulse that makes even your own feet twitch. In medieval weddings, ritual dances and playful games were more than mere entertainment. They were the very glue that bound the community to the couple, a choreography of joy and a theater of memory. At first, the dances seem simple, a circle of clasped hands weaving back and forth. But as you watch, you realize the complexity beneath the surface. The carol, the most ancient of wedding dances, loops the dancers in a living chain, their joined hands symbolizing unity not just between bride and groom, but between families, villages, and generations. The bride, radiant though tired, is pulled into the center of the ring, her skirts swishing as others spiral around her. It is as though the community itself is wrapping her in concentric layers of protection and delight. The groom isn't spared either. One moment he's bowing stiffly to his new in-laws. The next is shoved into a playful jig by a group of cousins who cheer every misstep. There is laughter when he stumbles, louder still when he recovers. It becomes clear that these dances were tests as well as celebrations, opportunities to watch how the couple bore themselves under pressure, whether they could laugh off clumsiness, whether they moved with grace or at least with good humor. Music shifts again, sharper now, and pairs form up for the estampi, a lively, stomping dance that rattles the floorboards. Boots thud, skirts fly, hands clap in rhythm. The couple are encouraged to take the lead, though it's obvious they're improvising. You can almost hear the crowd thinking, if they can stumble through this together, perhaps they can stumble through life together too. But dancing is only half the merriment. Soon, games erupt across the hall, drawing cheers and jeers. Some are innocent enough. Riddles shouted across the tables, tug-of-war contests, children chasing one another underfoot. Others verge on the risque. A popular tradition involves blindfolding the groom and spinning him in circles before setting him loose to find his bride among the crowd. Of course, the guests mischievously shuffle her about, guiding him toward other women, and roars of laughter greet every wrong guess. When he finally lands on his true bride, the hall explodes in applause. It is both a joke and a symbolic test of loyalty. Another game requires the bride to toss her garland of flowers into the crowd, much as modern brides toss bouquets. Yet here, the stakes are more communal. The catcher may be teased about becoming the next bride, but she might also be expected to lead the next dance or even sit at the couple's table. Participation is both an honor and a burden, reminding everyone that marriage is not a solitary fate but a shared responsibility. Outside, in the courtyard, rowdier guests take up games of wrestling or mock combat. You see two young men grappling in the dust while older women shout wagers, skirts lifted to avoid the flying dirt. Such contests, though rough, are meant to burn off excess energy and prove vigor, important qualities in a world that valued physical strength for survival. Sometimes even the groom is dragged in, forced to wrestle a cousin or fend off mock blows with a wooden sword. The message is clear: protect your wife, protect your household, prove your mettle before us all. What strikes you most is how these dances and games weave together levity and solemnity. Beneath the laughter is a current of symbolic meaning. To dance in circles is to affirm continuity. To play guessing games is to demonstrate faith and recognition. To wrestle is to show readiness for the hardships of life. Every step, every clap, every cheer is a rehearsal for marriage itself. Historians still argue how widespread these customs were, or whether they varied more by region than we imagine. In France, the carol seems to dominate accounts, while in England, the farandole, another chain dance, was more common. Some chronicles mention elaborate choreography, others describe little more than drunken shuffling. But across Europe, the idea of physical, communal joy remained constant. You can almost hear echoes of Roman wedding processions or pagan fertility rites woven into these medieval jigs, the old world never fully erased. You notice, too, the element of parody that creeps in. One group of men don masks and pretend to be brides, twirling clumsily and lifting skirts to reveal hairy legs. Another acts out a mock sermon about how to obey one's spouse, the exaggerated gestures earning shrieks of laughter. Parody, it seems, was itself a ritual. By exaggerating and mocking the roles of husband and wife, the community softened their weight, making them easier to bear. At the height of the night, torches blaze as the crowd moves outdoors for the branle, a line dance swaying side to side in hypnotic rhythm. The air is cool, the stars sharp overhead, and the stamping feet kick up a mist of dust. The bride and groom are hoisted onto benches, forced to kiss to the roar of the crowd. It is impossible not to be swept up in the current. You find yourself clapping, your body moving in rhythm even without knowing the steps. And here lies the deeper truth. The wedding isn't only about the couple. It's about the crowd itself. These dances and games stitch every guest into the tapestry of the marriage. Everyone leaves feeling invested, entangled, responsible. The couple's union has become a public performance, witnessed and reinforced by the laughter, sweat, and music of the whole village. When at last the music fades, and dancers collapse in heaps of giggles and exhaustion, you notice how the bride and groom lean into one another. They are breathless, sweat shining on their faces, but their hands are still linked. In that small gesture, you glimpse the meaning behind it all. Life ahead will be a dance, sometimes graceful, often chaotic, but as long as they find the rhythm together, perhaps they will never stumble too far apart. As you drift away from the firelit courtyard, the echo of drums still in your ears, you wonder how many modern weddings retain even a fraction of this raw, unfiltered joy. Today, we choreograph first dances for cameras. Then, they dance to stitch souls together. And the thought leaves you both wistful and oddly envious. The music fades behind you, replaced by a quiet murmur as attention shifts once more. You notice the way people glance at the bride and groom, really look this time, not for their actions or their laughter, but for the very fabric that covers them. In medieval weddings, clothing was far more than decoration. It was a carefully constructed language of wealth, status, virtue, and intention. You trudge closer, trying to absorb the full visual tapestry, silk shimmering with candlelight, furs draped with studded elegance, belts, and cords glinting with metallic threads. Each stitch seems to hum with meaning, and you realize that tonight, the garments themselves are performers in this ritual drama. The bride's dress is the first thing that catches your eye. A deep, rich color, perhaps a royal red or a muted sapphire, laid over layers of linen and fine wool. Her bodice is tightly laced, accentuating posture as much as form, and the long sleeves trail along the floor as she moves. You lean closer and notice tiny embroidery along the hem, flowers, vines, and occasionally a bird or two. Some historians still argue whether these motifs were purely decorative or carried coded messages, vows of fertility, protection from evil, or personal family emblems. Either way, the detail is astonishing, a miniature universe stitched into fabric. You notice the veil next, heavy and delicate all at once. Not merely a symbol of modesty, it is a shield against both prying eyes and supernatural interference. Some say that the veil is borrowed from ancient Roman tradition. Others argue it reflects the Church's influence, emphasizing the bride's purity and submission. As she lifts it briefly to sip from her cup, you catch a glimpse of her face, and the effect is subtle but powerful. The veil transforms her, rendering her simultaneously visible and untouchable, both human and ethereal. The groom's attire is no less laden with meaning. He wears a tunic dyed in colors that might indicate family status or personal wealth, trimmed with fur along the collar and cuffs. A belt is cinched tight at his waist, often embroidered or studded with small metal ornaments. The choice of fabric is significant: wool for warmth, silk for prestige, leather for toughness. Every fold, every clasp signals to the assembled guests not just who he is, but what he brings into this union. You notice his shoes, sturdy, polished, practical, and realize that in a world of mud, stones, and winter slush, even footwear sends a message about readiness for life's hardships. Accessories play their own subtle games. Brooches pin together layers of fabric, sometimes etched with initials or family crests. Rings, worn on both hands, signify allegiance as well as wealth. Gloves are not merely for warmth. They may be passed down, borrowed from a fortunate relative, or newly crafted to symbolize a clean slate. You notice a small dagger tucked into the groom's belt, which may seem alarming to modern sensibilities, but here it's a symbol of protection, readiness, and virility. Colors themselves carry weight. White, often associated with purity, may appear in undergarments or veils, but red, gold, green, and blue dominate public display. Red signals wealth and power, gold conveys blessing, green fertility, and blue loyalty or divine favor. You see these hues repeated across the hall, in attendant's garb and even in the ribbons decorating the hall. The visual vocabulary is elaborate, and you realize the wedding is as much about reading these symbols as it is about watching people move. Then there's the curious mix of personal expression and communal expectation. Some brides incorporate their own creative flourishes: an unusual stitch, a pattern borrowed from a favorite fabric, a color combination that sets them apart. Some grooms flaunt a bright feather in their cap or an unusual sash, signaling confidence or daring. Historians still argue whether these deviations were widely tolerated or quietly scolded, but either way, they hint at the tension between individual desire and societal expectation, a dance mirrored in the rituals themselves. Fur linings, in particular, catch your attention. Mink, sable, or fox trims indicate status, sometimes even signaling regional alliances or trade connections. To a medieval guest, spotting the type of fur on a groom's sleeve could reveal his family's wealth, influence, or business ties. You note a young man observing the bride's elaborate cuffs and whispering to his neighbor, a conversation about fabric quality doubling as social intelligence gathering. Clothing here functions as communication on multiple levels simultaneously: aesthetic, practical, and political. Headwear carries its own semiotics. The bride's coif or hen nin, tall, conical, or truncated, defines rank and sometimes marital intention. A groom's hat may be tilted to suggest fashion sense or family allegiance. In some regions, married women wore special veils or caps once the vows were complete, a public marker of their new status. The layers of meaning pile up, and you feel your head spinning. Nothing here is mere ornament. Every thread, knot, and clasp is a message encoded in cloth. Quirky tidbits abound as well. In parts of Northern Europe, brides carried small bells sewn into their hems, meant to scare off evil spirits or mischievous fairies. In other places, grooms wore tiny charms or religious symbols stitched inside their tunics, secret blessings known only to them and the divine. You can almost hear the tiny jingling of unseen bells with every step, a subtle rhythm marking the passage of the ceremony and life beyond it. You notice the interplay between practical and symbolic, too. Layering served both warmth and virtue, sturdy shoes both for travel and as indicators of reliability. In winter weddings, thick gloves doubled as fashion statements and essential protection against cold. Sleeves were long to impress, short to allow movement, belts tight for posture, loose for comfort. The medieval wedding ensemble is a study in dualities: beauty and utility, piety and performance, individuality and conformity. And then there's footwear. You had hardly noticed before, but the bride's shoes are pointed, a trend that fluctuated over the century, but with a practical sole underneath to navigate the stone floors. Some couples even wore mismatched shoes intentionally, a folk custom meant to confuse malevolent spirits. The oddities in dress aren't mistakes. They're deliberate gestures in a language that blends superstition, fashion, and social signaling. You see the subtle dance of mirrors, too, not literal mirrors, but reflection in social interaction. Guests study the attire, interpret the symbols, exchange whispers. A nobleman notices the embroidery, a peasant notes the hem's cleanliness, and each mentally catalogues the resources and connections signaled by clothing choices. This is medieval semiotics in action, clothes as texts, read by the community to confirm status, virtue, and allegiance. Even small children are dressed with intention, sometimes in miniaturized versions of the adult's garments, to extend the symbolism of fertility and continuity. You spot a ring bearer swaying along the edge of the hall, his tiny cap adorned with a borrowed ribbon, each step a rehearsal of the larger meanings around him. By the end of the night, after feasting, dancing, and charms, the visual impact of clothing persists. You realize that medieval wedding attire does more than decorate bodies. It encodes hopes, obligations, alliances, and status, telling a story as rich and layered as any song or prayer in the hall. You walk away from the ceremony thinking less about the fabric itself and more about the narrative woven into it. The bride's lineage, the groom's duties, the family's expectations, and the whispered blessings of every guest who has studied, admired, and interpreted the garments. You may never have the vocabulary to read every stitch, but you feel it, the story embedded in every hem, veil, and buckle. And in that understanding, you realize the medieval wedding isn't just an event. It's a tapestry in motion, each participant a thread contributing to a story of union, survival, and hope. The flickering candlelight casts shadows across the hall, and as your eyes adjust, you notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The visual feast of garments and jewels gives way to a more ephemeral yet equally powerful element: sound. Music is no mere accompaniment at a medieval wedding. It is a force that binds, commands, and communicates. As you edge closer, you realize the minstrels have begun their performance, and the hall vibrates with instruments both familiar and foreign. Lutes pluck delicate patterns, shawms shriek bright melodies, drums thrum like distant hooves, and small bells jingle at every step of the dancers. The music is the pulse of the evening, and you feel it coursing through your own body. You trudge along the edge of the crowd, noting the positions of the performers. The minstrels are treated almost as quasi-official figures, their skill and repertoire a matter of reputation. Some are long-established professionals, their hands calloused from decades of plucking, strumming, and bowing. Others are apprentices, their fingernails raw, but their voices clear and bright. Historians still argue about the extent to which minstrels were itinerant entertainers versus employed members of noble households. Either way, their role is central. They are mediators between sacred ritual and communal festivity, translating ceremony into sound that all can understand. The first piece is a carol, though not in the Christmas sense. This medieval carol is a circular song with verses alternating between leader and chorus, encouraging communal participation. You feel yourself drawn into the rhythm despite the centuries separating you from the dancers. It is easy to imagine that the carol evolved from ancient folk traditions, each step and note carrying whispers of earlier celebrations, long before anyone worried about legal documents or dowries. The circular motion of the dance mirrors the circular nature of the melody, reinforcing the idea of continuity and unity. Next, the minstrels strike up a more vigorous tune, an estampi characterized by its repeating rhythmic phrases and playful leaps. The couple is again called forward to demonstrate their skill, though it is less about perfection and more about endurance, coordination, and willingness to be observed. You notice the bride's dress swishing, skirts catching light with every turn, while the groom stomps heavily to keep time. Guests clap, cheer, and sometimes jeer, their reactions a mixture of encouragement and good-natured mockery. The music, it seems, is both a test and a celebration, a way to reveal character under communal scrutiny. Then comes a quieter, almost intimate piece, a melody for the bride, played on a lute with delicate tremolos. The hall hushes as she pauses to listen, the veiled face reflecting candlelight. The purpose is symbolic, a personal blessing rendered through sound. In a world where literacy is limited, music is a language everyone understands, capable of expressing what words alone cannot. You notice that even those not directly involved in the dance respond. Children sway, elders tap their fingers, servants and guests alike nod in appreciation. The minstrels are narrators, and tonight their story is the marriage itself. Humor creeps in, as it always does. One performer mimics a drunk groom, weaving between dances and tripping over the hems of skirts. The audience erupts in laughter, and even the real groom chuckles, a flash of relief that the absurdity of life can be contained, at least for a few measures. Quirky traditions abound. In some regions, minstrels might throw small ribbons of flowers into the audience at specific musical cues, creating a multi-sensory experience. You catch one small bouquet drifting toward you, and the mingled scents of wax, roses, and spilled mead form an intoxicating olfactory backdrop to the sound. Outside, courtyard musicians add another layer. Bagpipes drone alongside drums and whistles, and the wind carries these melodies across open space, inviting neighbors who are not formally invited to listen, clap, or even join in. Music at a wedding is public property, shared with the world beyond the hall. It is an extension of the social fabric, connecting not just the couple and their guests, but the entire village or town. You realize that the sounds you hear are as binding as any vow spoken under candlelight. Certain instruments carry symbolic weight. The harp, for instance, is associated with gentleness and refinement, its delicate chords suggesting feminine grace and the blessings of nature. The shawm, shrill and penetrating, signals masculine energy and vitality. You notice the minstrels carefully balancing these tones, weaving a tapestry of sound that mirrors the dualities of the wedding itself, tender yet robust, sacred yet playful, personal yet communal. Games and music intersect, too. A lively tune prompts a blindfolded guessing game in the center of the hall. The bride or groom must find the other among dancing participants, guided only by rhythm, sound, and occasional shouted hints. Laughter rings out, and music becomes a tool to manipulate perception, orchestrating both chaos and order. Every note serves a purpose, whether practical, performative, or magical. Quirky tidbits abound. In some regions, minstrels were expected to incorporate secret songs of blessing into their repertoire, tunes whose lyrics were known only to the couple or the officiating priest. These songs might invoke fertility, prosperity, or the protection of saints. The belief that music could actively influence outcomes, a kind of auditory talisman, underscores the medieval mindset, where symbolism and reality were tightly interwoven. You notice the subtle improvisation happening throughout the hall. Minstrels read the room, adjusting tempo, rhythm, and volume according to reactions. A misstep in the dance triggers a comedic counterpoint. A heartfelt gaze between bride and groom elicits a tender trill on the lute. The performance is living, adaptive, interactive, less a recital and more a dialogue. You find yourself swept along, your own body unconsciously tapping, clapping, and moving with the cadence of centuries-old rhythms. The music also mediates space and time. Long before electric lighting or stagecraft, the sound delineates the boundaries of the wedding, the feast, the games, the rituals, the ceremonial dances. Shifts in melody signal transitions from one activity to another, cueing the community without explicit instruction. You watch as guests naturally rearrange themselves, a form of collective choreography informed entirely by auditory signals. Historians still argue about the exact repertoire of medieval weddings and how standardized it was across regions. Some chroniclers insist on a formalized set of pieces, while others describe spontaneous compositions and improvisation. What is clear is that music carried layers of meaning: moral, social, emotional, and even supernatural. A well-played note could bless the marriage, entertain the crowd, and instruct the couple simultaneously. By the late evening, the minstrels shift to a slower, more contemplative tune. The earlier energy of dance and games has subsided, replaced by a sense of reflection and intimacy. Couples huddle, children yawn, and the guests' laughter softens to murmurs. The music becomes a lullaby for a community that has celebrated, tested, and blessed a union in every conceivable way. You feel the resonance in your chest, a reminder that weddings are not only about sight and touch, but also about hearing, feeling, and internalizing the communal rhythm. When the final note fades, the hall exhales, a collective breath acknowledging completion. Music has carried the evening from ceremony to celebration to reflection. You step back into the corridor, still humming faint fragments of melodies, acutely aware that this auditory landscape is as essential to the medieval wedding as vows, bread, salt, or charms. Music doesn't just accompany the ritual, it orchestrates it, unites the participants, and weaves a memory that lingers long after the last candle guttered. The music recedes, leaving only the low murmur of guests catching their breath, and you turn your attention to another cornerstone of the medieval wedding, the dowry. Unlike modern weddings, where gifts are primarily symbolic or celebratory, the dowry in medieval Europe was a carefully calculated assemblage of wealth, property, and obligations, a tangible contract layered with social, economic, and familial significance. You watch as attendants carry heavy chests, baskets overflowing with textiles, and small wooden boxes bound in iron and decorated with intricate carvings. Each item is not merely a present, it is a statement of lineage, security, and strategy. The bride's family typically shoulders the majority of this contribution. Fabrics, silks, velvets, embroidered linens are laid out, their colors catching the candlelight and signaling the family's wealth and taste. Gold coins are counted and displayed, often in small sacks or ornate purses, each coin a testament to the family's ability to provide materially for the new household. Livestock, dowry lands, and household tools may accompany these treasures. You note a particularly gleaming cauldron, polished to a mirror finish, and wonder how many meals it will cook, how many family disputes it might witness over generations. What fascinates you is the dual symbolism of the dowry. Practically, it ensures the survival of the new couple, providing the tools, money, and property to establish a functioning household. Symbolically, it represents the transfer of responsibility. The bride's family contributes materially, while the groom's family accepts social and legal obligations in return. Every textile, coin, and piece of furniture is a message. We trust you with our daughter, now take her into your world. It is a negotiation as much as a blessing, played out in tangible objects rather than words alone. The ceremony surrounding the dowry is often highly performative. A clerk or priest may read aloud the inventory, making clear the value of the items and their intended purpose. You notice that in some cases, guests are invited to witness the transfer, ensuring transparency and communal acknowledgement. In this way, the dowry becomes public accountability. Should disputes arise later, the record of what was given is remembered by the entire community. It is less an intimate gift exchange and more a ritualized assertion of social contract. Negotiations themselves can be lengthy and fraught with subtle tension. You overhear a conversation between a bride's father and the groom's uncle, discussing the precise valuation of a bolt of cloth. Historians still argue whether these negotiations were genuinely flexible or largely formalized. Some sources suggest that haggling was common, others that dowries were fixed according to regional custom. Either way, the process underscores that marriage is never just private. It is a public act with material, legal, and social consequences. Gifts beyond the dowry also flow. Friends and extended family present items with varying degrees of practicality and whimsy. Knives for protection, embroidered handkerchiefs for good fortune, miniature animals carved from wood or bone. You watch a small boy proudly deliver a wooden horse to the bride, prompting laughter and a collective "ah" from the crowd. These gifts often serve dual purposes. They entertain, but they also carry blessings or warnings encoded in their material form. A particularly quirky example emerges when a wealthy uncle insists on including a live goose in the dowry. The bird is both a source of future sustenance and a playful symbol. Geese were thought to be vigilant creatures, capable of alerting households to danger. The animal causes mild chaos, flapping wings, and honking, but ultimately adds a layer of meaning to the proceedings, reminding you that medieval gifts often merged utility, symbolism, and theatre. Dowries also reflect political strategy. You notice that a silver goblet engraved with the groom's family crest is included among the bride's gifts. Such items serve not merely domestic purposes but assert alliances, cement bonds, and project influence. Marriage in this period is rarely just about romance. It is about territory, power, and legacy. Every coin, piece of jewelry, and textile carries the potential to influence social hierarchy for generations. The display of gifts is theatrical. Chests are opened and items arranged for all to see, turning the hall into a temporary museum of family wealth and taste. You note the care with which attendants arrange silks, stacking them to create color gradations, while metal objects gleam from polished surfaces. There is almost a performative rhythm. Open chest, display item, record value, nod to witnesses. You feel the precision behind every movement, the centuries of tradition encoded in this choreography of exchange. Even beyond wealth, the dowry carries moral and cultural significance. Certain items are included specifically to symbolize virtue or readiness for household management. Spindles, sewing kits, cooking utensils, and preserved food are all intended to communicate the bride's competence and diligence. Guests interpret these choices carefully. A well-prepared dowry signals a promising marriage and a capable daughter, whereas a sparse or poorly arranged contribution could spark whispers of inadequacy. Historians still debate how these material obligations affected women's autonomy. On one hand, the dowry can be seen as an instrument of agency, enabling a woman to influence her marriage through tangible contributions. On the other hand, it can also be viewed as a tool of control, where family wealth is exchanged for the bride's legal and social placement. In either reading, the dowry underscores that medieval weddings operate at the intersection of economy, society, and personal life, a complex web that transcends our modern conception of romance. The groom's family participates too, though differently. Their contributions are often less about display and more about promise, pledges of land, security, or future gifts. You notice a small casket of coins given to the bride's father as assurance of proper treatment. This is not charity, it is contract, part of the negotiated equilibrium that ensures mutual obligations are clear. You can imagine the mental calculations running through both families: value of land, wealth of livestock, strategic advantage in future alliances. Every coin and item is a node in a network of social and economic expectation. Beyond the financial, gifts carry symbolic and emotional resonance. A jeweled pendant or embroidered handkerchief may represent love, loyalty, or hope for offspring. You see a small carved dove tucked among the textiles, a token intended to invite peace, fidelity, and domestic harmony. These details remind you that medieval weddings are not devoid of sentiment. They simply express it through objects and rituals rather than cards or spoken words alone. As the evening wears on, you see guests inspecting each item, asking questions, commenting on craftsmanship. The dowry is not merely received. It is scrutinized, validated, and woven into the collective memory of the community. Future references to the marriage might cite the quality of the dowry or the cleverness of the gifts, embedding the event into both social and historical record. You realize that every object has dual existence, as practical tool and as enduring narrative marker. Finally, the dowry concludes with a ceremonial sealing. Chests are closed, coins counted, livestock led away, and witnesses pronounce the transaction complete. A wave of relief and satisfaction passes through the hall. The material foundations of the new household are established. You feel the gravity behind the gesture. In this act of giving and receiving, generations are implicated, futures secured, and alliances affirmed. As you step back and observe the bride and groom now encumbered with both symbolic and practical wealth, you sense the extraordinary complexity of this tradition. Dowries, gifts, and negotiations are not just about property. They are about survival, reputation, and legacy, all wrapped in a ritual that is at once social, economic, and deeply human. The glittering coins, embroidered fabrics, and playful geese tell stories of trust, ambition, hope, and communal involvement. You understand that medieval weddings, in their intricate choreography of material and symbolic exchange, are far more than celebrations. They are the very architecture of society itself. The candles have burned lower, and the hall seems to hum with anticipation. It is time for the feast, a cornerstone of the medieval wedding that combines sustenance, spectacle, and social theatre into one unbroken flow. You trudge along the edges of long wooden tables piled high with platters, trays, and bowls, your senses assaulted by the smell of roasting meat, spiced sauces, and sweet pastries. This is no simple meal. It is a living tableau of abundance, status, and communal bonding, a ritual that transforms sustenance into storytelling. The centerpiece is, unsurprisingly, the meat. A whole boar may lie on a trencher, its skin crisp to a golden sheen, head presented with a garnish of herbs and fruit. Chickens, ducks, and occasionally even swan glisten under the flickering candlelight. Some scholars still argue whether these extravagant displays were as common in smaller villages as chroniclers suggest in courts, but the symbolism is clear. Feasting is a demonstration of wealth, generosity, and the capacity to provide. You watch the guests' eyes widen as servants carve the meat, juices spilling onto the boards and floor. The aroma alone is intoxicating, a signal that abundance, and by extension, social power, flows through these halls. Bread, of course, is omnipresent, both as sustenance and as ritual. You notice elaborately shaped loaves, braided rings, miniature animals, even effigies of saints, placed strategically on tables. Breaking bread is not just practical. It is symbolic, a gesture of unity. Guests pass loaves around, snapping off pieces to share, reinforcing the communal aspect of the wedding. Historians still argue whether these ornate breads were primarily for display or for actual consumption, but either way, their presence underscores the dual function of feasting, nourishment and narrative. Then there are the sweet dishes. Honeyed tarts, almond cakes, and spiced fruit preserve the flavors of the season while signaling sophistication and access to rare ingredients. You watch a young page sneak a pastry, giggling when the master of the hall looks away, and you are reminded that feasts were interactive performances, with room for both ceremony and playful subversion. Guests not only consume food, they negotiate behavior, observe etiquette, and signal allegiance through subtle actions at the table. Drinking plays an equally important role. Large flagons of ale and wine circulate constantly, with guests pouring for one another as a sign of camaraderie. The act of raising a cup, of toasting the couple, is both celebration and contract. It reinforces bonds between families, cements friendships, and signals social cohesion. You notice the clinking of cups, the slushing of wine, and the occasional spilled drink, all woven into the larger choreography of communal interaction. Some guests are more delicate, some more boisterous. All are participating in a ritual that blends merriment with societal signaling. Games of indulgence often intersect with the feast. Guests may compete in contests of drinking, quizzing, or storytelling. One man challenges his neighbor to a riddle contest between sips of mead. Laughter ringing as wrong answers lead to playful punishments, such as wearing a cap adorned with feathers or reciting a humorous verse. Quirky and theatrical, these diversions provide levity while reinforcing social hierarchies. Wit, endurance, and humor become as important as wealth or status in the eyes of the assembled. The spatial arrangement of the feast itself is loaded with meaning. The bride and groom occupy prominent positions, often at the head table, surrounded by immediate family and key allies. Seating arrangements communicate rank and influence. Who sits near whom signals social hierarchy and relative importance. You observe whispered discussions as guests assess positions, calculating alliances and potential disputes. The feast, you realize, is as much about diplomacy as it is about nourishment. Historians still debate the role of specific dishes in conveying symbolic meaning. Some suggest that particular foods were chosen to invoke fertility, luck, or divine favor. Almonds for prosperity, pomegranates for abundance, or peacock for grandeur. Others argue that practical considerations, availability, seasonality, preservation, played a larger role than any symbolic reading. Yet even if some meaning is conjectural, the layering of edible symbolism, ritual, and performance is undeniable. Every bite is a message, every shared dish a miniature social contract. You notice a subtle interplay between spectacle and participation. Servants carve, pour, and distribute, but the guests actively engage, eating, laughing, and gesturing. Children dart under tables, snatching crumbs, while elders nod approval or mutter gentle admonishments. The meal is a microcosm of the larger wedding. Hierarchy, interaction, humor, and ritual all compressed into one extended sequence. Participation is mandatory, but the boundaries of behavior are flexible, leaving room for improvisation. Quirky traditions pepper the feast. In some regions, a small silver ring might be hidden inside a pie, granting the lucky finder a blessing of love or fertility. In other locales, ale might be spiced with herbs believed to ward off ill luck or ensure harmony between households. You watch a young woman bite into a tart and leap back, triumphant at discovering a token within. Laughter spreads through the hall, echoing centuries of similar antics, reminding you that playfulness and superstition are inseparable companions at these celebrations. Drinking, too, carries performative and symbolic weight. A toast is not just a personal sentiment, it is an affirmation of community and the social contract. Guests raise cups for the couple's health, long life, and prosperity, but also for familial honor and continuity. You notice that each sip, each gesture, is observed and interpreted. A missed toast might be considered impolite. An overzealous one might invite ridicule. The communal aspect is paramount. The act of drinking together fortifies bonds, signaling unity and mutual responsibility. The feast also functions as an educational space. Observers learn etiquette, hierarchy, and social expectations by watching the interactions of others. The younger generation, particularly, absorbs lessons in behavior, negotiation, and subtle signaling, all while consuming spiced meats and sweet pastries. You see apprentices mimicking the gestures of their elders, understanding that marriage is both performance and preparation, and that every action, even the way one cuts meat, carries meaning. As night deepens, the combination of music, food, and drink produces a collective euphoria. Laughter grows louder, movements become more fluid, and the hall vibrates with energy. Yet beneath the revelry lies a thread of subtle observation. Alliances are reinforced, rivalries noted, familial reputations codified in every glance and gesture. The feast is both spectacle and strategy, a social engine driving cohesion and memory. By the end of the night, guests are exhausted, full, and warmed by both food and drink. You notice the bride and groom leaning into one another, cheeks flushed, hands still intertwined. The feast has done more than fill stomachs. It has united bodies, strengthened networks, and embedded the event into communal consciousness. It is a celebration, a performance, a ritual, and a rehearsal all at once. You step back, savoring the lingering smells, the residual laughter, and the subtle resonance of shared experience, recognizing that in medieval weddings, the act of eating and drinking together is as essential as vows or dances in binding the community and blessing the marriage. The hall quiets after the final course, leaving only the soft crackle of torches and the occasional scrape of a chair as guests shift and stretch. It is in this calm, almost expectant pause that the subtler, more mysterious elements of the medieval wedding come into play: superstitions, omens, and fortune-telling. You trudge carefully through the lingering candle smoke and notice the way eyes flick towards certain guests or objects with a mixture of reverence and apprehension. In medieval Europe, weddings were considered moments charged with supernatural potential, and every action, from the placement of a shoe to the direction of a torch flame, could be read as a message from the unseen world. The bride herself is often the focus of these omens. A veil, for instance, does more than signify modesty. It is believed to protect her from jealous spirits or malevolent fairies that might seek to disrupt her union. Some brides carry small charms sewn into their garments, tiny pouches of herbs like rue or rosemary, miniature crosses, or bits of coral. You notice a faint jingling as she moves, likely from tiny bells hidden in her hem, intended to ward off invisible threats. Historians still argue whether these charms were ubiquitous or largely confined to specific regions, but their presence underscores a pervasive concern with unseen forces shaping the success of the marriage. Fortune-telling is woven into the evening in both playful and serious ways. Guests might interpret the first item a bride or groom touches after the ceremony as a sign of their future role. Will she grasp a knife, indicating domestic skill? Or a coin, indicating wealth and resourcefulness? Will he reach for a book, hinting at wisdom, or a belt, hinting at discipline and protection? You notice a young maid whispering interpretations to her neighbors, their giggles mingling with the quiet murmurs of the hall. Even the smallest gestures are loaded with potential meaning, and the air is electric with speculative anticipation. Animals often carry omens as well. Birds released during the wedding might predict fertility or longevity depending on the species, flight pattern, and even color. You spot a small sparrow perched near the rafters, and a guest quietly interprets its chirping as a favorable sign. Outside, you can hear the low bleating of sheep brought in as part of a gift or dowry, each animal potentially imbued with symbolism. Medieval weddings, you realize, were ecosystems of meaning, where natural life, ritual objects, and human behavior intertwined in complex webs of prophecy and precaution. Food, too, plays a role in divination. Certain pastries or confections might conceal charms, symbols, or coins. A lucky bite could signal prosperity. A bite that yields nothing might require additional ritual to appease spirits. Children and servants often act as unsuspecting participants in these micro-rituals, creating a layered interplay of chance and interpretation that keeps everyone alert. You catch a small piece of marzipan with a coin inside being found, and the resulting laughter is tinged with reverence, as the fortune is quickly whispered to the bride and groom. Odd customs abound, reflecting the mingling of folk belief and courtly etiquette. In some regions, guests toss rice, wheat, or beans at the departing couple, ostensibly to promote fertility, wealth, and good fortune. You watch as some grains land in the bride's hair, others in the groom's boots, creating a playful but meaningful tableau of blessing. Historians still argue whether these rituals originated as pagan customs later absorbed into Christian practice, or if they were independently developed, but the effect is consistent. The community collectively projects hopes and fears onto the couple through symbolic action. Divination might also occur in more private settings. A bride could be asked to choose among several knives or spoons hidden in a chest, each representing different life outcomes. The choice might be entirely random, but interpretations are taken seriously. Sharp blades might predict challenges, ornate spoons prosperity, or a bent tool might signal a turbulent relationship. You notice the groom leaning in, eyebrows raised, as he watches his bride's hand hover indecisively over the items. The act is playful, yet weighted with meaning, illustrating how superstition and ceremony blend seamlessly. Candles themselves are divinatory instruments. A flicker to the left might suggest fortune, to the right, caution. A sudden guttering flame could be read as a warning of a quarrel or misfortune. You trace the wavering shadows along the walls and the faces of those observing them, realizing that attention to subtle movement and light was a crucial skill for medieval wedding guests. It is a sensory literacy that transcends words, teaching both observation and interpretation as vital tools for navigating the uncertainties of life and marriage. Omens can also be social. You notice whispered exchanges about the placement of guests at tables, the order of dancing, or the way servants move through the hall. A misplaced chair, a dropped cup, or an accidental bump can take on symbolic meaning, particularly in a community attuned to signs and signals. Laughter, correction, and gentle teasing become part of the ritual, emphasizing both the seriousness and playfulness of interpreting fate. Quirky superstitions abound. In some parts of Europe, the bride might step over a threshold backward to prevent evil spirits from following her home. In others, a broom would be placed in the hallway to sweep away misfortune. You spot a servant discreetly nudging a small branch into the doorway, and the bride steps carefully over it, smiling faintly at the ceremonial necessity. Even these small gestures are performative, reinforcing communal beliefs while creating a sense of continuity and tradition. Historians still debate how literally these superstitions were taken. Some argue that most participants regarded them as charming but ultimately symbolic, while others insist that in certain rural areas, beliefs in curses, spirits, and omens were profoundly influential. You sense that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, a layered understanding of ritual, play, and belief that varies according to context, class, and personal conviction. The night air outside provides further opportunity for divination. Guests might interpret the pattern of stars or the direction of the wind. A sudden breeze could be an angelic blessing or a warning. The combined sensory landscape, sound, scent, touch, and visual cues becomes a multi-layered canvas for reading fate. You feel the subtle tension in the courtyard as participants scan the sky and trees, recognizing signs that only exist within the interpretive framework of shared tradition. Fortune-telling also extends to the body itself. Palmistry or reading lines on the hands might be performed quietly in corners, often by older women or wise folk. You notice a small gathering around a matronly figure, fingers traced delicately across the palm of a curious bride, lines and shapes interpreted as signs of longevity, fertility, or prosperity. It is intimate, yet entirely communal knowledge, shared among those deemed trustworthy, and forming a bridge between personal fate and collective understanding. By the end of the evening, the combination of superstition, omen, and divination has suffused the hall with a sense of layered meaning. Every glance, gesture, or object carries significance. You realize that these rituals serve multiple purposes. They reassure, amuse, educate, and bind the community together. They provide a symbolic framework within which the uncertainties of marriage and life can be managed, predicted, and, perhaps, even gently mocked. As the night deepens and guests begin to tire, the omens and fortunes linger in the minds of all present. You notice the bride and groom, quietly holding hands, their expressions a mix of amusement, contemplation, and perhaps a touch of or at the invisible forces said to be watching them. The rituals remind you that medieval weddings were not merely events of law, ceremony, or festivity. They were spiritual, psychological, and deeply communal performances, where the seen and unseen collided to bless, test, and narrate the beginning of a shared life. The candles have guttered low, and the hall settles into a quiet rhythm as the focus shifts to the spiritual core of the medieval wedding, the religious ceremony and the influence of clergy. You trudge carefully toward the dais, noticing the way the space itself changes, the scent of incense weaving through the air, the hush that falls over conversations, the subtle posture adjustments of every guest. In medieval Europe, religion was inseparable from marriage. It provided both legitimacy and moral authority. You realize that the clergy are not just officiants. They are arbiters of social order, interpreters of divine will, and guardians of ritual propriety. The bride and groom move forward, guided by attendants and perhaps a parent, and you notice how every step is choreographed with care. The church or chapel itself is adorned with tapestries, candles, and, occasionally, gilded icons. Light filters through stained glass, casting colors that shift across the stone floor, creating an almost ethereal stage for the unfolding ritual. You observe the subtle symbolism embedded in architecture and decoration. High ceilings representing the heavens, arches signifying protection, and windows depicting saints who silently witness the vows. Historians still argue whether these visual cues were consciously integrated into weddings or simply adapted from broader religious practices, but their effect is undeniable. They immerse participants in an environment that emphasizes sacredness and awe. The officiating priest wields authority, both spiritual and social. You note his vestments, richly embroidered and trimmed with gold or silk, signaling rank within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. His gestures are deliberate, hands raised, arms extended, fingers tracing signs of blessing. The priest's voice rises and falls in a measured cadence, reciting prayers and exhortations that blend Latin and vernacular phrases. You catch a snippet of a blessing, noting how repetition and intonation create resonance, embedding the ritual deep within memory. The presence of clergy transforms the ceremony from a contractual arrangement into a sacred covenant. The vows themselves are carefully scripted, though variations exist across regions and centuries. You hear the promise of fidelity, obedience, and mutual support, each phrase weighted with theological, legal, and moral significance. In some traditions, the bride's declaration of obedience to her husband is emphasized, reflecting societal norms and religious expectations. In others, the couple's mutual consent is highlighted. Historians still debate the extent to which vows reflected genuine personal autonomy versus the dictates of church law, but either way, the spoken words carry immense symbolic weight. Rituals surrounding rings are equally potent. The exchange of rings signifies both a physical and spiritual binding, a circle symbolizing eternity. You notice the priest's hand steadying the bride's as the ring slides onto her finger, followed by the groom's own gesture. Sometimes, the rings are blessed with holy water or incense, anointing them as both personal tokens and sacred objects. You can almost feel the collective attention in the hall, a communal meditation focused on this small, metallic symbol of union and covenant. The ceremony is punctuated by gestures and physical movements that carry layers of meaning. Kneeling, bowing, the joining of hands, and the crossing of thresholds all serve as non-verbal communication between the couple, the clergy, and the assembled witnesses. Even the direction the couple faces, toward the altar, the congregation, or each other, conveys theological and social nuance. You notice a subtle choreography that ensures the ritual is both visually coherent and spiritually resonant, blending doctrine, custom, and practical movement. Communal participation is crucial. The congregation is not merely present. They are witnesses, moral guarantors, and sometimes even participants in symbolic acts. Responses to prayers, hymns, and blessings engage the crowd, reinforcing the social significance of the union. You observe the way guests lean forward, mouths forming silent echoes of the priest's words, their postures conveying investment and attention. The ceremony is as much about the community as it is about the couple. Their vows resonate outward, binding families and neighbors in shared moral and spiritual witness. Quirky rituals pepper the religious proceedings. In some regions, a small amount of grain or rice is blessed by the priest and tossed over the couple to ensure fertility and prosperity. In other locales, the couple might pass under a floral arch or weave together symbolic ribbons blessed by the clergy. You notice a subtle scent of herbs, basil, rosemary, or rue, wafting through the air, accompanying prayers and hymns. Each sensory element reinforces the spiritual import of the ritual, creating an immersive experience that blends sight, sound, smell, and gesture. Clerical influence extends beyond the ceremony itself. Priests often advise families on appropriate timing, legal documentation, and the inclusion of specific rituals. You notice the careful attention to canonical law. Witnesses must be present, blessings recited in correct sequence, and objections formally addressed. Historians still argue about the degree of flexibility in these ceremonies. Some accounts suggest strict adherence to church law, while others indicate local adaptation and improvisation. Either way, clergy serve as gatekeepers, ensuring the sacred and social dimensions of the wedding are maintained. Blessings and prayers can take multiple forms. The priest might invoke saints associated with marriage, fertility, and household harmony. You hear names you recognize: Saint Valentine, Saint Anne, and others less familiar, reflecting regional devotion. Each invocation carries both protective and aspirational weight, embedding the spiritual hopes of generations into a single, shared ritual. Guests silently absorb these blessings, internalizing them as moral and spiritual support for the newlyweds. Sacraments, when observed, reinforce the sanctity of the union. Holy water, chrism oil, or incense might be applied, each act conveying purification, protection, and consecration. You notice the subtle layering of symbolism: water for cleansing, oil for anointing, smoke for the ascent of prayers. Each sensory and material component intertwines with theology, producing a multi-layered ritual that is as complex intellectually as it is aesthetically. The positioning of witnesses, including family, nobility, or local dignitaries, further strengthens the social fabric. Their presence signals approval and oversight, ensuring that marriage is both legitimate and recognized within the broader hierarchy. You observe nods, whispered commentary, and small gestures of respect that encode both social standing and moral affirmation. The ceremony, you realize, is simultaneously personal, spiritual, and political. Quirky elements occasionally creep into the ecclesiastical sphere. In certain regions, the bride might be required to carry a small mirror to reflect malevolent spirits, or to ensure that she is marrying someone of honorable intent. You notice subtle glances at the mirror, the way it catches candlelight and throws fragments of reflection across the stone walls. These oddities highlight the interplay of superstition, ritual, and ecclesiastical sanction. Even within the structured framework of the church, folk belief finds space to coexist and influence behavior. By the end of the ceremony, the couple is consecrated, blessed, and fully integrated into the spiritual and social order of their community. You notice their expressions, a blend of solemnity, relief, and exhilaration. The clergy step back, hands folded, eyes scanning the assembly, ensuring that the ritual has been witnessed and validated. The hall seems to exhale, and the stage is set for the subsequent celebrations, the feasting, dancing, and storytelling that will carry the wedding from sacred affirmation to social revelry. You step back, taking in the full effect: architecture, light, scent, gesture, and voice combine to create a sensory and symbolic tapestry that ensures the marriage is both morally sanctioned and socially recognized. The religious ceremony is the spine around which all other elements, feasting, music, superstitions, and gifts, are structured. It is a performative, spiritual, and social anchor, grounding the union in a framework that extends beyond the individuals and resonates across generations. The sacred rituals have concluded, and the hall begins to vibrate once more with movement, sound, and laughter. It is time for the public spectacle of the medieval wedding: dancing, entertainment, and performance that carry the celebration from solemnity into exuberance. You trudge along the edges of the hall, noting the way the energy shifts with the changing roles of participants. Music swells, feet pound against wooden floors, and the collective heartbeat of the community drives the rhythm of the evening. In this space, performance, social bonding, and subtle competition converge, creating a living tableau of human interaction. The dancers take center stage first, often the bride and groom themselves, flanked by close family and attendants. Their movements are guided by custom, music, and social expectation. A waltz-like procession, a circular carol, or a more intricate courtly dance with steps designed to display skill and poise. You notice how the bride's skirts swirl, catching candlelight and revealing glimpses of elaborate embroidery, while the groom's posture and gestures emphasize strength and confidence. The dance is not merely entertainment. It is a performative extension of the vows, expressing unity, harmony, and the beginning of shared life. Courtiers, servants, and guests are not passive observers. Participation is expected and encouraged, though often hierarchical. Nobility may be observed performing intricate steps to display refinement, while lower-ranking attendees improvise within their skill set, often adding comic flair. Laughter, applause, and gentle teasing punctuate the rhythms, reminding you that the spectacle blends formality and levity. Historians still debate the degree to which these dances were standardized across regions versus highly localized, but the social function is clear. They reinforce hierarchy, cohesion, and communal joy. Entertainment often extends beyond dance. Minstrels, jesters, and performers intermingle with the crowd, offering musical interludes, comedic sketches, or feats of skill. You notice a juggler tossing knives while narrating a humorous story, and a small crowd of children and adults alike gathering to watch, half in awe, half in nervous excitement. These performances serve multiple purposes: diversion, social commentary, and moral reinforcement. Humor and risk intermingle, creating memorable moments that linger in communal memory long after the night has ended. Games are interspersed between dances. The Finding the Bride game, where a blindfolded groom must locate his bride among a circle of dancing guests, often provokes laughter, teasing, and minor chaos. You see guests helping, obstructing, or offering hints, each action layered with subtle commentary on social bonds, trust, and observation skills. The game is both a test and a celebration, reinforcing communal participation while entertaining and sometimes gently embarrassing the main participants. The music driving these activities is complex and immersive. Lutes, harps, shawms, drums, and bells converge to create overlapping melodies, each instrument contributing to the collective rhythm. You notice subtle improvisation. A drummer adjusts tempo to match a misstep, a shawm player accentuates a comedic action, and a harpist shifts chord progressions to complement the mood of the hall. Music is both conductor and participant, orchestrating the energy, signaling transitions, and weaving together multiple layers of sensory experience. Lighting, too, is part of the spectacle. Torches, candles, and sconces cast moving shadows, elongating limbs, swirling skirts, and glinting off polished surfaces. The interplay of light and motion transforms the hall into a living canvas, enhancing both the aesthetic pleasure and the psychological impact of the performances. Quirky traditions sometimes appear: mirrors placed strategically to reflect candlelight, small bells attached to dancers' shoes, or smoke from scented herbs drifting through the space to signal shifts in mood or act as a protective charm. Participation is both voluntary and obligatory, a delicate balance enforced by social expectation. You notice that those who hesitate or fail to follow rhythm may be gently teased or encouraged by friends and family, while those who excel receive subtle recognition. Dancing and entertainment function as social barometers, reflecting competence, grace, wit, and group cohesion. Even minor improvisations, an unexpected spin, a playful gesture, become part of the communal narrative, demonstrating creativity and adaptability within prescribed forms. Spectacle often incorporates storytelling. Minstrels or performers may enact brief vignettes, tales of heroism, cautionary fables, or humorous renditions of local legends. These narratives overlap with the wedding's symbolic meaning, reinforcing ideals of loyalty, love, prudence, and communal memory. Guests absorb these stories while simultaneously participating in the dance, blurring the lines between observer and performer. You sense a layered rhythm, physical, auditory, and narrative, each reinforcing the others. Quirky traditions pepper the night. In some regions, a bride might toss a small bouquet or handkerchief toward unmarried guests, signaling future fortune or playfully invoking superstition. Guests scramble to catch these tokens, their reactions a blend of excitement, reverence, and humor. You notice laughter, whispered bets, and mild competitive energy, all contributing to a heightened sense of engagement. Even minor gestures acquire amplified meaning, encoding communal hopes and anxieties in playful action. Dancing and entertainment are also vehicles for teaching social norms. You observe younger attendees mimicking gestures, postures, and expressions of older, more experienced dancers. Hierarchies are reinforced: who leads, who follows, who improvises, and who waits. These performances serve as implicit education in etiquette, spatial awareness, and communal interaction, ensuring continuity of social understanding across generations. Historians still debate how consciously this pedagogy was applied, but its effects are visible in the structured yet fluid interactions of participants. The night air occasionally enters through open doors or windows, mingling with smoke, incense, and candle scent. You notice how the breeze subtly affects the dancers. Skirts billow, hair shifts, and performers adjust rhythmically. Even nature participates in the spectacle, contributing to both aesthetic beauty and symbolic resonance. Superstitious interpretations might arise here. A sudden gust could be read as an auspicious sign or a warning, integrating environmental contingencies into the narrative of the wedding. As the evening progresses, energy fluctuates but rarely diminishes entirely. Dancers rotate, performers improvise, and music adapts. You note the blending of ritual and play, observation and participation, tradition and improvisation. The spectacle is both organized and chaotic, a structured chaos that reflects the vitality of community life. Every gesture, note, and laugh contributes to an enduring collective memory of the wedding. Finally, as the night winds toward a close, there is a gentle unwinding. Dancers slow, music softens, and performers gradually retreat. Guests, flushed and exhilarated, gather in smaller groups, recounting moments of triumph, humor, or minor embarrassment. The spectacle leaves an imprint not only on the participants' bodies but on their minds, a shared narrative encoded through movement, sound, and shared experience. The public, performative aspect of the wedding ensures that the union is celebrated, remembered, and socially reinforced. You step back and take in the entire tableau: the swirling dresses, the musical intricacies, the laughter and cheers, the subtle improvisations, and the interweaving of superstition and strategy. Dancing and entertainment at a medieval wedding are not mere diversions. They are essential threads in the fabric of communal life, binding together social, emotional, and cultural strands into a living, breathing ritual that is as immersive as it is enduring. The feast is ended, the music has faded, and the hall's laughter now hums like a distant echo. It is time for the final act of the medieval wedding: the departure, the blessings, and the forging of lasting memories. You trudge alongside the couple as they prepare to leave, sensing a delicate tension in the air, anticipation, relief, and the lingering excitement of a day that has been both performative and deeply personal. In medieval Europe, the end of the wedding was as significant as its beginning. Every gesture, every object, every word uttered contributes to the transition from public spectacle to private life, sealing the community's involvement in a lasting covenant. The departure is a ritual in itself. Guests line the paths leading from the hall, forming a corridor of good wishes, symbolic barriers, and occasional playful interference. Some carry torches or candles, their flickering light creating a shifting tapestry of shadow and illumination. You notice the interplay of darkness and flame. The path ahead is partly revealed, partly mysterious, a metaphor for the unknown journey the couple now undertakes together. Historians still debate whether certain gestures, throwing coins, scattering herbs, or tossing grain, were primarily intended for blessing, protection, or playful chaos, but the effect is universally to punctuate the transition from ceremony to new life. Blessings from family and community members are an essential component of departure. You watch as parents place hands on the shoulders of the bride and groom, murmuring prayers, advice, or warnings. These moments are intimate yet public, embedding moral, spiritual, and social guidance into the final interactions of the wedding day. Elders' words carry particular weight. Their blessings serve as both assurance and expectation, a framework that the couple will carry forward. The ritualized nature of these blessings ensures that community approval and support accompany the newlyweds into the next phase of life. Objects gifted at the end of the wedding also carry symbolic weight. You notice small tokens pass quietly: a piece of bread from a parent, a coin from a godparent, or a handkerchief embroidered with protective motifs. Each item serves multiple functions: practical, symbolic, and mnemonic. The couple now carries not just material items, but the intentions, hopes, and prayers of everyone present. These objects are anchors for memory, creating tangible links between the newlyweds and the larger social and spiritual ecosystem that has supported them. Departure is often theatrical. The bride and groom may be lifted onto horses or carried in a ceremonial cart, while attendants and guests accompany them in a procession. You notice the layering of sound, movement, and visual display. Bells jingle, laughter mingles with prayers, and the rhythm of hooves or wheels punctuates the moment. Spectacle persists to the very end, reinforcing the idea that marriage is not solely a private contract but a deeply social act, embedded within the collective consciousness. Superstitions and omens accompany the departure. A sudden gust of wind, the flight of a bird, or the unintended stumble of a guest may be interpreted as signs for the couple's future. You notice a small child tossing herbs at the departing pair, his parents nodding approval. These micro-rituals bridge play and belief, entertaining while simultaneously invoking protective and auspicious forces. Medieval weddings are saturated with this duality: joy and superstition, performance and moral guidance, seamlessly intertwined. Even the spatial dynamics of departure are meaningful. The direction the couple takes, toward home, toward a journey, or toward a specific landmark, carries symbolic resonance. Crossing thresholds, stepping over thresholds backward or forward, or pausing at particular markers can signify protection, transition, or respect for the unseen. You notice the groom gently helping the bride over a doorway, a simple gesture rich in layered meaning: care, respect, and adherence to custom. The social memory of the event begins crystallizing immediately. Guests recount amusing anecdotes, point out subtle performances, and highlight particular successes or failures in ritual or dance. You overhear whispered conversations analyzing minor missteps or extraordinary flourishes in the feast, dancing, or ceremonies. These discussions are not trivial. They encode communal standards, reinforce social bonds, and create a shared narrative that preserves the wedding in collective memory. Religious and moral guidance often accompany the departure. Priests or elders may deliver final exhortations, reminding the couple of obligations to God, community, and family. You notice that these pronouncements are carefully balanced between blessing and instruction, reinforcing that marriage is simultaneously joyous and serious. The couple listens, sometimes smiling, sometimes solemn, absorbing the advice as both a spiritual and social compass. Humor persists even in this final act. You witness playful obstacles set by friends, a symbolic river of rolled cloths to jump over, teasing requests to perform a small dance before leaving, or riddles that must be answered to proceed. These traditions reinforce community cohesion, allow for levity, and demonstrate that even at the end of formal proceedings, the ritual is flexible and responsive to human emotion. Objects left behind carry echoes of the ceremony. Candles may be extinguished ceremonially, decorations carefully removed or preserved, and tables cleared with ritualized attention. You observe how each action is both practical and symbolic. The end of festivities is marked with deliberate care, ensuring that the physical space transitions from celebration to normalcy without erasing the memory of the event. Children play a subtle role in departure rituals. Young pages and attendants may scatter flowers, carry small torches, or perform minor tasks with attention to ceremonial precision. Their involvement is simultaneously playful, instructive, and socially reinforcing. You notice how their actions, guided by both whimsy and protocol, create continuity. A new generation learns both the choreography and the social significance embedded in communal celebration. Historians still debate the degree of personal autonomy allowed in departure rituals. Some argue that the couple's path and actions were highly prescribed, while others suggest localized variation and improvisation. Either way, the rituals serve as both closure and initiation. They conclude the wedding as a public spectacle and initiate the couple's journey into domestic and communal life, linking personal experience with collective expectation. Finally, as the couple departs, the hall empties slowly, leaving behind echoes, scents, and memory. Guests linger, exchanging stories, reflecting on the day, and allowing the communal energy to dissipate naturally. You feel the layering of sensory and social experience. Every object, every gesture, every song, every step has contributed to a tapestry of memory that will endure in both individual and collective consciousness. The departure is not an ending but a bridge, carrying intention, blessing, and narrative forward into the married life. You step back, taking in the entire wedding as it winds down, from the exchange of dowries to feasting, dancing, superstition, religious ceremony, and finally departure. The event is an extraordinary fusion of material, spiritual, and social elements, each meticulously orchestrated to create meaning, reinforce bonds, and leave lasting impressions. Medieval weddings, in all their sensory, symbolic, and performative complexity, are as much about community and memory as they are about the union of two individuals. The couple now moves forward into life together, carrying not only vows but the weight and warmth of a community's attention, guidance, and celebration. Now, the candles have dimmed, the hall is quiet, and the echoes of laughter, music, and clinking cups fade gently into memory. You sit back, feeling the warmth of the feast still lingering, the faint scent of herbs and incense drifting in the cool air. The bride and groom have departed, their hands intertwined, carrying with them not only vows but the blessings, jokes, and quiet omens whispered by generations of family and community. The music has softened, replaced by the subtle hum of torches and the occasional rustle of leaves outside, and you feel a sense of completion, of closure, as the day's complex tapestry slowly unwinds. Throughout this journey, you've witnessed dances swirling in candlelight, feasts that overwhelmed the senses, curious superstitions that guided every step, and ceremonies that wove together the spiritual and social. You may even find yourself smiling at the oddities, coins hidden in pies, mirrors to ward off spirits, or a jester juggling knives while narrating a story. Yet beneath the spectacle, there was meaning, intention, and connection, a reminder that weddings, then and now, are as much about the people around the couple as about the couple themselves. Take a deep breath. Let the sights, smells, and laughter settle softly behind your eyelids. The medieval world may feel distant, yet through these rituals and customs, you sense the humanity that bridges centuries, hope, humor, and the desire to bless and protect loved ones. Let the imagery linger, fading gently like the last flicker of a torch. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and drift into the night with the knowledge that weddings, strange, beautiful, and layered with meaning, have always been a celebration of life, love, and community.